Hi everyone, we'll continue our search for true Bible studies with lesson 4, chart 7. Right, so lesson 4, chart 7 helps us see the parallel and see the significance of the Old Testament way of worship, right, and make a parallel to the sacrifice that Jesus did. Now, many times when people read the Old Testament and the New Testament, it is easy for people to come away thinking that they are unrelated or that they refer to very different things. But rather, what I hope to show us is that within the practices that were instituted in the Old Testament, they were preparing people, right, for something that's to happen in the New Testament, right? So if people understood the principles behind what they were doing in the Old Testament, they will realize that these are preparing them for something even greater to come, right? So let's get down to looking at the parallels and the significance. Now, as we covered in the previous lesson on how man is to approach God through a blood sacrifice, right? Then maybe let's begin by reading the verse here, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 5. They, referring to the Jews and the Israelites, serve in a system of worship that is only a copy, a shadow of the real one in heaven. For when Moses was getting ready to build the tabernacle, God gave him this warning: be sure you make everything according to the pattern I've shown you here on the mountain. Right. So in the previous, a bit more in detail on the significance of approaching God in this manner. But right now, as we try to again look at the key points, right? In the Old Testament worship, right, man is supposed to come with a sacrifice that is deemed to be good enough, worthy enough, so that the sacrifice, the blood sacrifice in this case, can be brought before God for the forgiveness of sins. So when the animal is sacrificed, right, as man comes before God in humility, right, the sacrifice that is good enough, okay, or rather the sacrifice that's considered worthy enough can be offered before God, right? So that is the general principle of the purpose of sacrifice. But as the Bible verse here says this, that when God gave Moses these instructions, what the author is trying to help us see is that the specific pattern that Moses has built the tabernacle on is underlying a real principle, a principle of something that is to come. Just as a shadow, when we see a shadow of something, we know that the shadow points towards a real object. Likewise, the tabernacle, whatever is contained in the tabernacle, right, is like a shadow of the real thing that is to come. And what is this real thing, or the more significant thing? And that is Jesus himself as the sacrifice. So let us read the verse here. So Christ has now become the high priest over all the good things that have come. He has entered that greater, more perfect tabernacle in heaven, which was not made by human hands and not part of this created world. With his own blood, not the blood of goats and calves, he's entered the most holy place once for all time and secured our redemption forever. So the sacrifices, the animal sacrifices that man has to make in the Old Testament through the tabernacle is pointing to something that is more important, that when mankind today, or rather since the time of Jesus, realizes that they need to come in humility, right, before God, realizing their shortcomings, God in human flesh, as Jesus Christ, becomes that perfect sacrifice. So Jesus, by being that perfect sacrifice, right, has become worthy enough to be brought into God's presence, and his perfect sacrifice is able to pay for our sins once and for all. So as we take a step back again and look at the parallels, because sin is such a grievous thing because of the consequences of sin, right, is death, and sin must be judged. And because of the consequences, blood must be shed. In the Old Testament, God has allowed mankind to sacrifice animals in their place. God loves humankind, so rather than human beings have to pay for their sins with their own blood, God has allowed imperfect animals to pay that sacrifice. And because animals are imperfect, right, it is really a stopgap measure. God allows this sacrifice to delay judgment for 1 more year. However, when Christ came as the perfect sacrifice, Christ is able to make that sacrifice once for all so that our sins can be paid up, right? And we no longer have to pay for our sins. So as we close up this lesson, let's look at some of the key takeaways. Right. In the Old Testament, the Israelites realized in order to approach God, they needed to have proper sacrifices. They needed a proper way to approach Him. Right. And this way of approaching God is a symbol to prepare them that one day Jesus will perfect the way we can approach God because He is the perfect sacrifice, right? And He will make the sacrifice once and for all.